Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of the American Society of International Law, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our 2020 mid-year meeting. Over the next 2 days, the Research Forum will explore the most exciting new work taking place in the field of international law, with expert-led discussions of papers on a broad range of current topics. This evening's Practitioners Forum will feature keynote remarks and a panel discussion on a cutting-edge topic related to digital technology, privacy, and human rights. We're also offering networking events, research workshops, mentoring sessions, and professional development programs geared to students and new professionals embarking on their careers. I'd like to thank our hosts, the faculty, staff, and students at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. They've been a wonderful partner in organizing this meeting. While we're unable to be in Cleveland altogether and on Case Western's beautiful campus, we've greatly appreciated their hospitality and support. And I especially want to thank Dean Michael Scharf, who's not only our host for this meeting, but also co-chair of the Research Forum Committee. If you haven't yet had the chance, I encourage you to watch his welcome message on the lobby page of the mid-year meeting site. Michael, we could not be here without you. You have my deepest thanks. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the other brilliant co-chairs for the Research Forum, Kristen Eichenser and Blanca Montejo, and committee members Angela Banks, Zachary Kaufman, Jessica Peak, and Carlos Vasquez. They reviewed the abstracts, selected the papers, and organized the expert-led panels you will attend over the next 2 days, and I'd like to thank them for their brilliant work and dedication. Before we begin, one very special moment. I'm honored to announce the recipient of the annual David D. Caron Prize. David was beloved to so many of us. He wore many hats in our world and did so with intelligence, grace, dignity, and above all, kindness. He was a distinguished international judge, lawyer, and teacher, and a friend and colleague who served as president of the Society from 2010 to 2012. David created the Research Forum during his presidency, and it remains an important part of his legacy. In 2018, the Society created the David D. Caron Fund to support, enhance, and perpetuate the Research Forum. The fund supports fellowships to enable younger scholars to participate in the forum and an annual prize for the best paper presented at the forum by a current student or recent graduate. It's a truly fitting tribute to David's legacy. It's now my pleasure to invite David's wife, Susan Spencer, to announce the winner of the 2020 David D. Caron Prize.
Before I announce the 2020 winner of the David D. Caron Prize, I would like to express my gratitude to those who made it possible. While David saw the need and opportunity for a research forum at the ASIL mid-year meeting, it took the ASIL community to bring it to fruition and to maintain its relevance. Thus, I thank the committee, Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and the ASIL staff for their outstanding work on this year's mid-year meeting. The David D. Caron Prize exists thanks to the generous donations of David's colleagues, students, friends, and family. A special thanks goes to Charles N. Brower. And the prize winner couldn't be announced without the work of the Caron Prize Selection Committee. Thank you, Schumann Keitner and committee members. I'm happy to announce that the winner of the 2020 David D. Caron Prize is Desiree Leclerc for her paper, The Disparate Treatment of Rights in Trade.
Thank you, Susan, and congratulations to Professor Desiree Leclerc. Professor Leclerc will present her paper tomorrow afternoon and will receive the prize at the 2021 annual meeting in March. I'd like to thank Shemin Keitner, who chaired the selection committee, and committee members David Biggie, Monica Hakimi, Stephen Coe, Kian Murphy, and Victoria Sahani. Thanks so much for the good work. It's now my privilege to introduce my friend and our keynote speaker, Baroness Helena Kennedy of the Shaws. Baroness Kennedy is one of Britain's most distinguished barristers. She spent her professional life as a champion of human rights, fighting discrimination, and representing those who struggle to have their voices heard within the legal system. Baroness Kennedy has acted in many prominent cases, including the Brighton bombing trial, the Guildford 4 appeal, the bombing of the Israeli embassy, and the abduction of baby Abby Humphreys, to name just a few. In 1997, Baroness Kennedy was elevated to the House of Lords, where she's a labor peer. She's a prominent writer and speaker, and is the author of 2 books on women in the justice system. Eve Was Framed, Women in British Justice, and Eve Was Shamed, How British Justice is Failing Women. She was the founding force behind the creation of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford University and directs the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She's a very seasoned observer of the American political scene, and we've asked her to share her thoughts on global engagement and multilateralism after the US election. She's graciously agreed to take questions from attendees, so please submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. Baroness Kennedy, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Hello, it's my great privilege to be addressing such a distinguished gathering, and I feel very flattered that you asked me to do your keynote address. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the organisation which I'm now working with, and tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a lawyer. I've been a practitioner at the English bar, although I'm a Scot, you can tell by my accent. But I have been a practitioner at the English bar for over 40 years. A long time. And I'm a Queen's Counsel, which means that I'm in a sort of cohort of lawyers who are the most senior. And it's an honour that's given to those of us who have reached a certain level in our work. And increasingly my work has become international, but I have essentially been a criminal lawyer in the criminal courts doing major trials. And major trials, by that I mean murder. I've done a lot of cases involving violence within the family, women killing husbands who've abused them for years and so on. But that was very much a sort of a part of my work. The major part of my work was doing political trials, the trials that came out of the Irish Troubles, trials that came out of terrorism more generally in different parts of the world, but which found its way into the British system, and also doing things like official secrets cases, espionage, different kinds of cases of that sort. So fairly high-end criminal work. And I've ended up as a member of the House of Lords. I sit on the Labour benches, and so I see law in its making, and I participate in the legislature. I recently was the head of an Oxford college. I did that for 7 years, set up an Institute of Human Rights, the Bonavero, and I now am heading up the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. Now, the International Bar Association is, the umbrella organisation of 188 bar associations around the world. Some of them great bar associations, some of them still in the early stages and really sort of learning what the functions of a bar association or a law society might be. Some of them, unfortunately, are in the pockets of government and are not independent at all. But many are there trying to professionalise lawyers in different parts of the world. Some of them are young, some of them have existed for a very long time. Now, we also have a great big global membership and many law firms around the world that belong to. So it's an organisation, global, great convening power, great influence, and independent. And the Institute of Human Rights within it is a much younger organisation. We were 25 years old this year, but we didn't get to celebrate it, although we had wanted to, but COVID put an end to that. But the bar, the International Bar Association was one of the things created after the Second World War, at the same time as the United Nations, at the same time as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all those conventions, the great sort of if you like, rules-based order that came into place and into being at that time. And the idea was that the world's lawyers should be the guardians of the rule of law and protect high standards and ethical standards, as well as being an organization that would be supportive to each other in our different nation states. And that solidarity, I think, is really important for lawyers, and no more so than now. And we make it one of our priorities to be there for lawyers who are under attack, lawyers who are being persecuted, for judges whose independence is being attacked, and we do that globally. So those are very key issues for us. But we consider ourselves to be the safeguards of the rule of law, which was what we were brought into existence to do. Now, I just wanted to say that the IBARI, the Human Rights Institute, which I'm now directing, and was invited to do that just 2 years ago, was created in 1995, and you can understand why. I mean, it was that great moment. It was a moment where, the Cold War was over. There were many reasons for celebrating the power of law and decency and all the good things that we like to feel that had been achieved in certain parts of the world. And there's no doubt about it that the end of the Cold War gave it an impetus to the creation of the Institute of Human Rights to be the protectors of the rights of individuals. Apartheid in South Africa was over, and there was a new South Africa. Totalitarian regimes in Latin America had folded, and the same was true in Africa. Many of those places which had not known democracy became democracies. There was this burgeoning of democracy. There was that sort of great triumphalism in a way about, that democracy and, if you like, free market capitalism had won the day. That was the Fukuyama notion of the end of history. Well, I too had my little moment of thinking of those things because at the end of the 90s, I remember giving a lecture on human rights, and I had become very much a champion of the creation of a Bill of Rights in Britain. I've chaired a thing called Charter 88, and we basically wrote the reforming manifesto for New Labour, which was to say that there should be a Bill of Rights, that there should be devolution, and countries like Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales should be determining things closer to home on many fronts. We argued for the reform of the House of Lords and for a Freedom of Information Act, which you all had. And one of the reasons why this all was so kind of in my bones was because as a young lawyer, I'd come to New York, I'd come to the United States, and I spent time with law firms. I had gone to the Supreme Court, and I saw and admired what happened in the United States, and I thought, we need some of that stuff embedded into our system, which is still too old-fashioned. Well, matters constitution, issues of rights have been bread and butter for me, and so as I was saying, I gave a lecture at the end of the 90s, and I said at that point we were involved in a huge case, which was that universal jurisdiction was being claimed and drawn down to seek the extradition of General Pinochet from the United Kingdom, where he had a house, and as so many folks seem to put down their sticks. He liked the medical system, he liked having tea with Margaret Thatcher, etc. And so he had a bolt hole here in Britain. And one of the examining magistrates, a judge in Spain, had issued a warrant for his extradition to Spain to be put on trial for crimes against humanity, for all the torture and killings and disappearances that had taken place under his regime. And so the case went all the way to our Supreme Court, and I thought, this is a key moment. The idea that there is no hiding place for people who've committed terrible wrongs, that justice will in the end come round. And I remember giving this lecture and saying, I believed that the 21st century would be the century of human rights. Well, tell that to the Marines. And because, of course, early on in the 21st century, we had that horror of 9/11 and all that flowed from it. And that was where I first became seriously involved with the International Bar Association and the Human Rights Institute, because the executive director, Mark Ellis, set up a task force to look at international terrorism. And terrorism was something that I knew quite a lot about. And so it was truly international, and it was an evidence-gathering task force. And we were concerned that the rule of law would not be kind of, if you like, undermined in order to deal with the horror of terrorism. That we had to still cling on to the importance of due process, of proper evidential standards and so on, and that we shouldn't shortchange all of those good things that we had created over many years in order to deal with with atrocities. And so we worked on this and produced a report, and that was one of the things that drew me in to really active participation with the International Bar Association and its Human Rights Institute. And I, at a later stage, I co-chaired another task force, which was to look at climate change and human rights. So I've been involved in a number of things. I actually ended up becoming a co-chair of the Institute of Human Rights before I was ever asked if I would take on the running of it in this particular period, which is, I think, quite a challenging one. And so you're going to ask me the questions of, well, was that moment of creating IBARI, the Human Rights Institute, was that great shift? Did it have all the promise that we'd hoped? And while, of course, it certainly has had a number of important things have happened in consequence, some of it has, of course, been less opportune than we might have thought. Globalization, which of course burgeoned and bloomed and became the greater after the end of the Cold War, has its benefits and its downsides, and people began to feel the threat of globalization, and there's no doubt that the seeds of nationalisms came out of that sense in which of being absorbed into something where there was no purchase, where you felt disconnected from where power really lay, and so I think that many people felt that strong sense of feeling more and more powerless, and of course economically people were feeling more and more powerless, because in fact globalization has undoubtedly created many richer people, but also for some particularly in developed countries, but not only, brought serious financial challenges. Now, one of the things that of course, followed from the horror of 9/11 was that we then had the Iraq War. There were all those issues. I mean, we had Guantanamo Bay. We had rendition. We had torture. I was involved in the cases involving Guantanamo Bay detainees who were British or had British citizenship or had been born and brought up in Britain. And we were all at that time so energizing with the business of Al-Qaeda's existence that some of those standards that we care about were being undermined. And we had ways in which trial processes, military commissions and so on were established. And in my own country, too, in the United Kingdom, ways in which intelligence was admitted into trials in questionable ways, intelligence which may have been based on torture, and cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. We too detained people without trial indefinitely, and those cases went to our Supreme Court. And I'm happy to say that our Supreme Court found against government doing those things. But many of those challenges are ones that I think have been eating away and eroding confidence in law and ways in which law has been undermined. one of the other areas that I've been very much involved in is with gender-based violence and violence in conflict, but gender-based violence in our own society, and it's happening everywhere. And of course, COVID is one of the things that has actually provided a cover for an acceleration of so much violence towards women. But the impunity that so many enjoy in terms of the violence that is experienced by women is still a serious problem in our society, and international law has not addressed it adequately, and those who investigate are often not trained well enough to obtain the evidence for this, and we haven't really got the business right in international law. And I'm going to say something to all of you, which is that it shouldn't surprise us, because women are not at the tables. Women have not been there in laws making, and if women aren't there, then you ain't going to have many of the things that women experience by way of persecution being included. And much of that, of course, is about attacking the very sexual being of women. But in our globalized world, I'm afraid, which came out of all those great things that were invented at the end of the 20th century, the way in which we had travel became so much easier, the ease of travel, and then of course technology and the developments allowing for greater connectivity, the mobile phone, the ways in which we could talk to each other so readily, the ways in which we could connect and do business so easily. The ways in which poor people with a phone in their hands in Africa could actually be doing business and making a living and so on. So huge advances made in terms of technology and the electronic transfer of money and so on. But of course, with all of that, has come the downside of some of it, the ways in which that has brought with us challenges that we've still to deal with internationally. Because the underbelly of any kind of cross-border marketization is black marketization, and so we've seen increases in trafficking, increases in we not forget even the business of drug trafficking. But I mean, every commodity that's possible, and then of course, we have it for sexual purposes, people being bought and sold, but we also have the business of all those other things that accelerate and facilitate legitimate markets being used for illegitimate markets, and so a huge rise in international crime and the crimes that come into nations through it, and the feelings of insecurity that creates for people, that things are out of control, and the blaming of immigrants and the blaming of foreigners and the business of other, and so we see it across Europe, but you have it in the United States as well, this rising feeling that others have to be kept out, or they will take away from us what we already have. And the rise of nationalism and populist governments taking more and more power to themselves has been one of the real developments of recent times, because with populist governments, of course, comes the business of attacking critics, diminishing opportunities for opposition. It becomes a ready thing to talk about reforming the judiciary, because you don't like the judiciary if they make decisions that are calling or are basically calling government to account. They don't like the lawyers who do that kind of work and attack the lawyers, attack the judges. They attack the journalists who write the stories about the ways in which there is corruption or there might be abuse of power. And so the media becomes under attack, or it's appropriated and taken into control. And so you see a pattern in places which is about taking away so many of the things that we hold dear. So that, freedom of assembly in terms of protesting. I mean, look at the world at the moment. What's happening in Belarus, what's happening in Nigeria, had been happening in Chile, what's been happening, you just think about it. Modi's India, places where protesting against terrible things are happening to people. And when people protest, against it, they're met with live ammunition. They're met with terrible violence from the forces of the state. And at the moment, we're working very closely with the opposition in Belarus, because the lawyers who are going to court for all of those people who are being arrested, peacefully protesting, women with white flowers in their hands, and yet ending up in court, taken away from their children taken into state control and orphanages and children's homes away from their parents. And so supporting the lawyers who are doing this kind of work and who themselves end up being thrown in jail. So it's a common feature. And what we're seeing also is the ways in which around the world attacks are being made on LGBTI people, on the reproductive freedom of women. Look at what's just happened in Poland, where women are not going to be allowed, even if there's a fetal abnormality and they're carrying a pregnancy that is not going to be sustainable, that they cannot make choices. And many of those things are happening because of a sort of fear of the changes that have been taking place in our world, recognizing the autonomy and the rights of individuals to live their lives as they want, to love and be loved as they want. So as I say, the focus of the work that I'm doing just now is about protecting lawyers, protecting judges, protecting protecting media freedom. We've got a big project, a multinational project with Britain and Canada, but many other countries joining in now about protecting journalists. And 200 and so journalists have been killed over the last 18 months or so. I mean, it's quite shocking what's been happening to journalists because they report on things that people don't like them reporting on. I want to just say to you, international law relies upon multilateralism. Multilateralism it's been the source for international law's creation. And once you see the destruction of multilateralism, an unwillingness to participate in the UN and in the bodies, there are times when all of us are highly critical of things that happen. It gives me no confidence at all that two of the main two countries that have just been voted to be running the UN's Human Rights Council are China and Russia, which have been such singular abusers of human rights. And so, there are problems, and there's no doubt that the UN needs to be reformed. But the only way that this world is going to actually be improved and where we are going to live by a sort of rules-based order is by having multilateralism, recognizing international courts, and being able to draw down international law. It is international law is the child of multilateralism, and as we see that being eroded, inevitably it means that international law is being eroded. And the UN at the moment is on the back foot. Undoubtedly, it's feeling that it's uncertain about its future. And so it's not being perhaps as proactive as one would have wanted it to be on many fronts. I was involved 2 years ago now in the investigation with Agnes Kalamar into the killing of Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered in the most brutal and terrible way. The brutality was really in the cutting up of a man's body, destroying the integrity of his own body, which encases his humanity. It's just horrifying. And yet the international community has not been as outraged as one would have wanted it to be. And one has to ask where the UN has been. And part of it, of course, is that our Security Council needs to be reformed. You can't have a Security Council which will always veto investigations into terrible abuses like that, because some of the parties know that they commit those kinds of abuses too. So we really have to have better discussions with our own governments about the need for multilateralism, why it's so important, and also to really strengthen law in its wider sense. But that really does rely on us as lawyers being the guardians, the stewards of law, making the arguments about why the rule of law matters, and that the rule of law in the modern world is values driven. It's imbued with values, and it doesn't matter whether you're a commercial lawyer or an immigration lawyer, whatever kind of lawyer you are. We're all human rights lawyers. We all have to see the importance of protecting and guarding the rights and dignity and humanity of each and every one of us. So that's what I wanted to say to you. It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
I want to thank Baroness Kennedy. It's certainly a lot to think on. I mean, it was a amazingly eloquent journey in terms of looking at the hope, the moment of hope that the 21st century would indeed be the century of human rights, and how that hope manifested in some of the challenges that came after, whether it's through the struggle with terrorism, globalism, the globalization process and what that means, Guantanamo, the Iraqi war, and the dynamic of women continuing not to be at the table where decisions are made. And I think all of that in terms of the dynamics, Helena, that you talked about in terms of eating away at the confidence in law. And what I found really inspiring about the message, though, is the idea of the role that multilateralism has to play. And that international law is really born from a view that multilateralism has within it as a structural component the ability and the mandate, if you will, to promote the rule of law. So I think part of what this dynamic suggests for us is, what does that mean for the way forward? And Baroness, you have spoken about the UN, some potential needs for reform. We've obviously all heard about calls about the Security Council in particular. And I think that is one aspect of rethinking, if you will, rules-based order, the post-war rules-based order, and trying to meet the challenges where they come. And that is one aspect of it. And I'm very interested in thinking about moving forward in this project of multilateralism and the promotion of international law and institutions. What are other steps that can be taken? Because as you say, we as lawyers are guardians of the rule of law. And I really like the perspective that all lawyers are human rights lawyers, in the sense that the rule of law is there, including to protect individuals, including to safeguard those basic rights. So I think in this moment, part of our struggle, and obviously there's a lot of anxiety out there as we're waiting on the eve of the US election, is to think about the way forward and the project of multilateralism in this moment of history. And I know we're getting some questions coming in, but that is a key theme in terms of the path forward, the way forward, and multilateralism. And as everyone knows, we're going to be exploring this theme further, including tomorrow in a panel discussing the US role in multilateralism. So I think right now we're going to, if you haven't already, please do populate the Q&A function with questions, and the Baroness will join us shortly to take those questions in live format. And the second question is, could you please drill more on what the rule of law means to you? You know, on that topic, on the rule of law, just last week, I addressed the International Law Weekend, the ILW conference on the international rule of law. And the dynamic that struck me is how much of our history has been about the making of the international rule of law and also resisting its unmaking. And that is a trend that really predated the post-war order. If you look at the role of the League of Nations, the PCIJ, the tremendous disappointment going into the Second World War that our international institutions had failed us, and coming out the other side, not really electing to engage in the demise of those institutions, but to strengthen those institutions. And you saw the process that led to the UN Charter signing, the process that led to the establishment of the Charter of the International Court of Justice, and what that meant in terms of the promotion of the rule of law. But very basically, I think that the rule of law just means that we as a society elect to be ruled by law and not by force. That we as a society reject the notion that rulers and leaders can lead by whim, that they are above the rules-based order that everyone else is subject to. And it is from that emanates this protection and very basic discussion about the protection of rights and the obligations of leaders in the protection of those rights. And so you have the evolution of international law and international legal institutions to meet that challenge. And as Helena went through, it's really been tested since the Second World War. It's been tested by the war, what some have called the never-ending war on terrorism, and what that means for civil liberty and balancing that against security. It's been tested by globalization because there's so many of us who had felt left behind by that process economically, intellectually, in terms of basic support. And the dynamic in history teaches us that that allows extreme nationalism and populism to take hold. And some would say, are we in a new era of the erosion of the rule of law, or have we seen this before? And of course, it's a really difficult question, but that is certainly an angle and aspect of what we face as lawyers, as guardians of the rule of law. And going forward, what are we expecting from our institutions? And I think at a bare minimum, we're expecting alacrity, ability to shift as necessary. Helena spoke of UN reform. We've spoken about that for a very long time, the Security Council in particular. And I see there's some questions about what it means to reform the Security Council. How can we actually get there when there is the dynamic of entrenched superpowers on the council? And getting to reform would require some kind of incentive to engage on an actual reform process. But is that where we are? I think there is a question here. You mentioned the disappointment over the appointment of Russia, China to the UN Human Rights Council. But of course, the council was designed to avoid that problem, which had plagued the Human Rights Commission before. Is this simply an inescapable problem of global multilateralism in human rights? And again, we're getting to the very core issues. And one aspect of Helena's comments that I think echoed in terms of, is it an inescapable problem of global multilateralism in human rights? As Helena put it, multilateralism is more the solution than the problem. And I confess that I very much agree with that, in that the pushback against multilateralism because of the failure seems very misplaced and categorically misplaced in my view, in the sense that we should be investing more, not less, in multilateralism, because that just means, what does that mean? It means more peaceful engagement, more channels of communication, more opportunities for diplomacy to address some of these entrenched issues. And it may be the case that the political incentives of Russia, of China, of the US in terms of some fundamental reforms will be very difficult to move to actually get to a point of change. But the point of multilateralism is to take opportunities, these historic opportunities, and actually create and work within those channels of diplomacy to effectuate change. And I think Bill Burns, I've had the privilege of seeing him at the American Society's first virtual annual meeting, spoke to the power of diplomacy to address even the most entrenched power dynamics with China, with Russia, in the context of where the United States is in its moment in history. And so to me, multilateralism isn't the problem, but it could be the solution. Let me see if some other questions. Does the climate change crisis change the demands on the global governance system? Can the UN effectively address an issue that seems to demand responses that infringe on sovereignty? So as Helena mentioned, she co-chaired the IBA group on the greening of human rights in the context of climate change. I have had the privilege of being the vice chair of that group and working with Helena on that project. And part of that project was thinking about the scheme of international law, not just human rights, but the larger scheme, and was it well suited in terms of dealing with a global issue like climate change. And for those of you who have seen that report, we got very concrete, very granular in the sense that the whole point of having an international legal system is to deal with global issues that states cannot deal with on a piecemeal basis as a matter of their domestic power. And that obviously is really part and parcel to why the difficulty with climate change is that states can't act unilaterally. There needs to be a coordinated global effort, and especially in bringing that to bear through our international institutions. So in my view, the UN, the context of having these multilateral discussions are inescapably critical to dealing with issues like climate change. And inherent in the UN process is that, and I wouldn't put it as infringement in sovereignty, but rather that the individual state's interests can align with global interest. Helena, hello.
Hello, lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Thank you
Great.
so much for your inspiring speech. It was really just a joy to hear your perspective, both in the long view and in the short view of where we are as a world. So thank you so much for those thoughts.
Please forgive me for not being with you live to begin with. It was just one of those horrible clashes where the foreign minister of Canada had wanted to have a meeting about a media. You know about this project, a big media
Yes.
freedom project involving Amal Clooney and a whole set of lawyers from around the world who are involved with media issues. And it came into existence because of the huge increase in the number of journalists being killed around the world over the last few years. But also, and of course, the Jamal Khashoggi case, but also the ways in which we're seeing the capture in many places of the media by authoritarian leaders, and also the ways in which during any kind of thing like COVID or during protests, the closing down of the internet and means by which people receive information, even about something like the pandemic. So that work is really important, and we're trying to draw more and more nations into it. It started off with Canada and the United Kingdom. It's under the umbrella of UNESCO, but the institute that I direct is running the secretariat for it. So I was having this conversation about the next steps.
Well, it's perfect in terms of the themes that you touch on in your speech. So thank you for sharing that work. I think one question, and we've been getting some really good questions from participants, is in light of the themes that you drew out in your speech, what role can lawyers play in advancing support for multilateralism and institutional reform of international organizations? As you say, lawyers are the guardians of the rule of law. We're all human rights lawyers. What do you think our participants should go away with, especially on the eve of the US election, where there's a lot of anxiety in the air, as you can imagine? What is the individual role of lawyers going forward? What's the most important thing in your view?
Well, I mean, the truth is that rights and law becomes nothing if there aren't lawyers, independent lawyers, to argue cases, to take up the issues on behalf of people in all the different areas where law provides the sort of a mechanism for making rights a reality. And so I think that we have to together be protecting judges when they're under attack. We have to be protecting lawyers, where lawyers lawyers around the world just now are having a pretty tough time, I have to tell you. We're even having it here in the United Kingdom, where lawyers who represent asylum seekers are being characterized as lefty lawyers, as though that were the situation at all. It's a way of, in fact, reducing and the professionalism of the lawyers who do this work and do it as independent actors, in this space. One of the things, of course, that is always misunderstood is the idea that lawyers have to be associated with their clients. I mean, the assumption is that, you know, if you represent someone who's charged with terrorist offences, you must be sympathetic with the terrorist outcomes, which isn't true at all. Is that back to that thing that we in Britain call the Erskine principle, or the cab rank rule, that we should always make sure that people are well represented, because that's how you keep the legal system strong and good and true. And that we should be able to do that without fear or favour. So what can lawyers do? I mean, I do think that we have to take a principled stand when we see the rule of law being undermined. And it's worth our while reminding ourselves what the rule of law means. It can often become very sort of soft and sludgy, the meaning of what the rule of law is. And it isn't, you know, the passing of laws by a government. If we learned anything from the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, which included trials of judges and lawyers who played a rather horrifying role in making possible Nazism and the persecution of minorities and so on. And so we've got to remember that there can be capture of the very idea of the rule of law. And the rule of law is not value-free. It's not a value-free area. And it is imbued with values which are about respect for individuals, about protecting minorities within a nation. And so we've got to be prepared to speak out about what the rule of law really means, because very often it's presented as being law and order, and that's not what the rule of law is. China proudly says that it has the rule of law, and sure, it has rule by law, but it's not what we would consider to be the rule of law. And in our contemporary world, we have to think, what are the values that we think should be embedded in there? And for me, they're human rights values, the values that are within the Universal Declaration.
You'd mentioned, and we've gotten some questions about UN reform. You mentioned UN reform. You specifically referenced the Security Council reform. How realistic is it, do you think, to think about Security Council reform when you have Russia, China, the United States, if you will, vested in the current orientation of the Security Council?
Well, you know, I do think that there has to be a rethink of the United Nations now. Here we are, so much a much more complex world, I think, than the world even in the late 40s, and so I do think that there should be an opportunity to revisit the whole institutional architecture. And I don't think that you know, going back to the sort of, if you like, the nations that were seen to be preeminent at that time, holding the only kind of votes, that seems to me to have served its purpose, and now it's over. And there really should be an opportunity of sitting down together. But you know, you do need to have such conversations, have to be conducted with great care and with language which is not insulting or abusive. And that's difficult, you know. The language that creates change and shift has to be I think, perhaps more respectful in the language that some of our international discourse has been conducted in recent times. And that is important, because I mean, I'm involved just now in a whole project which is to do with the Uyghur in China, and the concentration camps, the treatment of the women, the forced labor, the full horror. And we're trying to create, at the invitation of the exiled Uyghur community, a task, a sort of a people's tribunal, a people's task force, and being led by a very great international lawyer, Jeffrey Nice, who's Queen's Counsel, who was involved in the Milosevic trials and so on. And he and one of the things about all of that is that, you know, there was a time when those things should have been happening from the United Nations. You know, where is the UN at this time? Where is the UN Human Rights Council? We've just it's just we almost had the triumvirate of Saudi Arabia as well as China and Russia in there, and it's very difficult to have real conversations about human rights, when we know that finding a common language around all of this is very difficult. But at the same time, taking a big stick and just shouting, especially if there's a possibility that trade relations might be suspected as being the real motivation rather than the protection of human rights, that's problematic. And I think we have to find better ways of having dialogue and of having multilateral conversations. So yes, I want to see the UN reformed. I want us to have a sort of constitutional convention that would come together, that would be global, in order to look at what should a UN look like in the 21st century. And of course, it's not going to happen overnight. And you would have to have some very, very smart leadership to make it happen.
So let me pivot to one question that harkened back to some work we did together, which is climate change and legal regime. Its question is, does the climate change crisis change the demands on the global governance system? Can the UN effectively address an issue that seems to demand responses that infringe on sovereignty? So I'd love to hear your answer. I gave some thematic answers myself. I'd love to hear yours.
Well, it's so interesting, this business about sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's been a big issue for us in the United Kingdom just now over the whole business of Brexit. And you have to remember that the arguments for leaving the European Union was that we were going to reclaim our sovereignty. There are some things which require the pooling of sovereignty, where you actually, it's by pooling your sovereignty with the sovereignty of other nations that you actually can create real change. And so, it always made me anxious as I listened to the debates, which were very crude around leaving the European Union, which was, bring back control. Locating where real power is in our contemporary world is a very interesting thing. And it's no longer just located in nation states. And trying to pull back, as nationalist arguments would make it, to have your sovereignty simply located within the nation state, I think is not going to meet the challenges of the modern world. Mm-hmm. And one of those areas where you have to be prepared to actually work with other nations, and it's going to involve actually, cross-border collaborations and possibly legal initiatives that, are international. Climate change is one of them. And of course, there are others, but climate change is a pressing one. And so that's why it's a great source of regret to many of us who worked on that initiative that you were speaking about when I joined. It's a source of great disappointment to us that the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement, because it seemed to be that there was a movement forward, and we really have to take this seriously. So you did amazing work on that, Catherine. I mean, amazing work, and you were one of the most important actors in creating the report. And it was my first great experience of your work, but it was wonderful. And I'm afraid it has stuttered and not got further forward. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the interesting things is that lawyers in different countries are taking their own governments to their courts and saying, you make commitments to reduce, emissions and to reach certain targets, and you haven't done so. And our gender, like that case in mm-hmm. Holland, in the Netherlands, is actually being taken up in other countries too. And so it is interesting that pressing governments to meet the targets that were set is one of the important things that can be done. But this is a thing where we have to have better conversations with those who are involved in the oil companies and all the fossil fuel companies to look at how we address our future. And we have to somehow analyze whether protecting vested interests is going to save the planet. So there are important and difficult issues to negotiate, and we need the United States involved in this. Listen, I wanted to just say to everybody, I love the United States, and I have a home that I go to every summer, not this year, unfortunately, in Cape Cod. And for me, you know, part of my heart is in this country, the United States. And I want the United States to retain its position in the world of great influence, of great leadership, and we need you there. And I don't want you to be retreating from multilateralism. I really don't. I know that we're not talking politics here, but I do feel that multilateralism is essential to creating a better world.
I certainly agree. It was such a privilege working with you on the climate change issues. What's been interesting to me, Helena, as you said, as the United States took a step back from that issue, is to see what countries took steps forward to try to come into some leadership roles. And of course, interestingly, the notice of withdrawal for the Paris Agreement doesn't come into effect until the day after our election next week. So it remains to be seen whether the United States continues to step back or will actually step forward and hopefully back into some kind of leadership role in the context of the Paris Agreement. I think we have time for one more. And nope, we're actually out of time, but it was such a pleasure to have you here with us.
A real pleasure. American lawyers have been very important in my life. I have learned so much from lawyers in the United States, and so of course I was very happy to participate. And I want to say to all of you, speaking out as lawyers to protect the rule of law, you've always been in leading roles in doing that, and long may it continue.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure and a joy, not just for today, but for me to witness your legacy and how much you've done in promoting the rule of law. And I know that our viewers join me in thanking you for sharing your thoughts with us.